Well, thank you very much, Chris, for that introduction. As he said, I was one of the co-founders of this group 10 years ago, and I do work. 4 years ago, I left Atlanta for Nashville. I work at a company called Moon Toast. We're a startup up there that specializes in creating social rich media ad units to display in the social stream. And then we collect analytics on that and report that back to our clients. I'm no longer the VP there, as you said. I got downgraded, my own choice. Being a VP is really, really difficult. If you're not ready for that, then you don't know what you're getting into. But I'm the software architect at Moon Toast now. So that's much better job for me. And also, I do have stickers here. If anyone's interested, I've got a whole bunch of them. So come on up afterwards and grab one, and you can stick it on your laptop. The M punches out too. It's kind of cool. As Chris was saying, I'm one of the co-founders, and I wanted to take a few minutes before I get into the talk to kind of talk about a few things going on in the community, and to make kind of an announcement that's a little bit special to me, I guess, or for me, and that is that this week the PHP community lost a really one of our old-time members. His name was Richard Lynch. He was the original founder of the Chicago PHP user group, which started in 1997. And he was battling brain cancer for quite a while, and thought he was in remission a little while ago, a couple years ago, but it came back earlier this year with a vengeance. So I just wanted to mention that the reason I mean, aside from the fact that he is a really prominent member of the PHP community, he was one of the big inspirations for starting this user group, and basically a lot of other user groups. Chicago PHP was a big inspiration for people, so I just wanted to kind of call attention to him and in memory of him. This talk is something that has been on my mind for quite some time. And in fact, by the way, I have a cold, so I sound a little bit stopped up, so I apologize for that. But this topic's been on my mind for quite a while. I was asked to give this presentation back at one of the PHP Architect Web Summit series. And Eli approached me and asked me to give this presentation, and I was really excited to be able to put it together because it was something that had been on my mind. I've been thinking about really the history of PHP, where it's come from, and where we are today, and how we develop applications, PHP applications today. See, I've been working with PHP for probably about, 14 or 15 years now, and this talk kind of brought to the surface a lot of memories of the good old days, so to speak. The good old days where you would take, all you really had to do to create a web page was slap some HTML, and we didn't even use CSS back then. We just used tables and colored in with shim pixels. Remember those days? And we might put in like a Perl script or something to create a dynamic guestbook, for example. So this was a trip down memory lane. So I hope you will permit me to wax nostalgic a bit as I kind of go back to the past to bring forward to the future where we are today in modern PHP development. First, my PHP story. As I mentioned earlier, I had started this user group 10 years ago, and so this is me 10 years ago on a tram in Amsterdam, actually 9 years ago, at the 2005 International PHP Conference Spring Edition in Amsterdam. If you've been around for a while, you might recognize a few of these people. This is Steph Fox in the front. There's Tobias Schlitt. There's Stefan Neufeld in there. Let's see, who else? We have Christopher Kuntz and Marcus Wolf also in this picture. A bunch of the European PHP developers. This was my first PHP conference I'd ever been to. It was right after we started our meetings here, or maybe just before. And it was also the first conference I'd ever spoken at. So if you can put two and two together, first one I'd ever been to, first one I'd ever spoken at, probably not a great idea to send a newbie like that overseas to speak at a PHP conference. And in fact, I have an interesting story. It's a side story about the whole experience, and I blogged about that on my blog. So if you want to go read about what happened to me in Amsterdam and the embarrassing things that happened there, you can go check that out. But my story doesn't start there. It actually goes back further to the year 2000, and that's when I first became introduced to PHP. I first encountered PHP around March or April of the year 2000. I was working at a small web development shop here in Roswell, Georgia. I had been given the task to make some updates to a web page. So naturally, what do you do as a new web developer who needs to make an update to a web page on a production website? Well, you open up an FTP client, and you open the page up, and you make the changes and save it, and it just, boom, it's live, right? That's what we did, or that's what I did. I didn't have any mentors. I didn't have anyone showing me the ropes of what proper development was. All I knew was that there was this file that I could open up, and it looked mostly like HTML. It had HTML in it with a few PHP tags. So I opened up this file. It ended in .php3 at the time, if you'll remember that, and I was able to make my changes and save them. At the time, I didn't really know that it was a PHP file, but I had been familiar with Perl and active server pages, so I knew about embedded scripting languages. I also didn't know that this was PHP version 3, and I didn't know that version 4 would be coming out later that year. But fast forward 5 years, and I found myself speaking at a conference in Amsterdam. I had, at that time, contributed several articles to some magazines, and I had contributed a lot of answers on and help on the PHP general mailing list. And I contributed a chapter to a book on PHP. I probably thought I was hot stuff, and I'm sure there was a fair amount of hubris. And if you look at the smirk on my face, that's what it is. It's just me going, I'm really hot stuff here. But, excuse me, needless to say, as I'm entering my 14th or 15th year using PHP, I've been really humbled to be a part of this community and to really get an opportunity to meet a lot of the people and to meet a lot of you and to help contribute back to it. That's what all of this has been about for me. User groups, writing. I mean, obviously, I love it and enjoy doing it, but it's all about giving back because there were people there in the beginning who gave of themselves to really help me learn. That's what, and that's why I mentioned Richard Lynch earlier. He was a staple of the mailing list. If you had a question, you asked that question, and he would respond, and he would give you a good answer. He was a good teacher. I've seen an awful lot of changes over the years in PHP, and I think that you'll see as we progress forward that the whole community has seen a lot of changes for the better. So PHP goes back to 1994 and 1995 when Rasmus Lerdorf took a collection of scripts and released his PHP personal homepage tools as open source to the public. The PHP we have is very different from the PHP then. The project moved quickly, and we saw PHP 3 released in 1998, and then PHP 4 released in the year 2000, followed up with PHP 5 in the year 2004. And if you look at this picture, this is someone commented that, I don't know, they made some joke about the picture, them looking really old, like 10 or 15 years ago. This is actually only like 4 years old, so that was only, it's a recent photo. Actually, the joke, Derek's probably going to watch this, and I don't care. The joke was about Derek having lost his hair. So this is going back to, I looked at the Wayback Machine and tried to pull up the oldest, one of the oldest PHP.NET pictures I could, or scrapes I could find. This is from PHP 3.0 being out. This is 1998. And as you can tell, the website really hadn't changed a whole lot until recently. But the web development team has done a great job in bringing PHP forward to the modern age You can even browse it on your mobile device now, and it's mobile responsive. So kudos to them for that. But back in 2000, when I first opened that PHP file over FTP, I noticed that it had the file extension php.3. If you've been using PHP for a while, you'll probably remember that we used to use the convention of naming the files by the version of PHP we're using. So there's .php3, and then later we added .php4, and that's around the time that that fell out of convention. Not only was PHP as a language different, but the way we wrote code in PHP was very different, drastically different, as you'll see in a few minutes. This isn't due to changes in the language, but it's really due to changes in the community and in best practices that are encouraged and in how other projects are developed. These other projects that are developed show us new ways of building things and new ways of writing code. And they promote best practices. I believe that PHP 5 is what paved the way for all of that to happen. PHP 5.0.0 Beta 1 was released in June of 2003. It was long awaited and met with much anticipation and expectation. There was a lot of excitement in the community, if you'll remember back. How many of you were back then coding in PHP when 5.0 was coming out? Okay, so good. A good half of the crowd. I began using the beta version right away. Who began using the beta version right away? Okay. Who was so excited that they launched production web servers with the beta 1 version? All right. And the production web servers that I launched the beta 1 version on were Windows 2000 Server. We were using SQL Server as the data source, and that same version of PHP ran on those servers for at least the next 4 years. After I was long gone. So I even deployed a website with the beta version. So there was a lot of excitement, lots of books were published. In fact, the one up in the upper right-hand corner, PHP 5 Unleashed, which is by John Coggeshall, has a chapter from me in it on pair. But the reason I showed this slide is really just to kind of see there was a lot of excitement. These books were all published before 5.0 came out, and then 5.0 came out, and there was a lot of excitement. So what did PHP 5 do for us that PHP 4 could not do for us or did not do for us? Well, PHP 5 introduced a brand new object model. It also introduced things like the standard PHP library, which had a bunch of iterators and array classes that we could now use and extend. It introduced type hinting, at least at the object level and array level. We now had exceptions. We got a brand new XML integration in there with simple XML and DOM, and this was hot stuff back then because this was well before we all started using JSON and decided that XML sucked. And then PDO was introduced. So PHP 5's object model did some things for us that I think paved the way for a lot of the changes that we see in the software we build today and a lot of the tools we use. One of the biggest things it did was that it now passed objects by reference by default. Previously, whenever you would take an object and pass it into a method, or if you passed it, or if you reassigned it to another variable, it would have the act of cloning that object. So the object now differed. If you made a change to the object out of a class versus inside a method of a class, then those two objects were out of sync now. So the way we got around this, though, was we used the ampersand, equals ampersand, passing by reference, right? Well, other programming languages always support, or had supported, I won't say always, but other programming languages had supported pass by reference objects by default for a long time, like Java, for example. So PHP now had that. We also got class constants and a bunch of other object-oriented programming principle goodies. Visibility, like public, private, protected properties of methods, abstract classes and interfaces. But the biggest thing I think that came into being was this autoloader, and I'll talk more about that later. As PHP has grown up, we've gotten a lot more good things in the language. As 5.1 came out, we got a faster engine, and actually, as each new version has come out, the engine has gotten much faster, to the point where now we're seeing the fastest engine we've had, and we're seeing a PHP that is really good and robust. Other things that came in here are PDO extension now enabled by default. 5.2 introduced some other things that have been really helpful, such as the JSON extension coming into being and being on by default, as well as some new date-time things. Oh, another thing, the input filtering extension was added. I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. 5.3, this is the one where I think that PHP now sees itself as being the modern PHP we use today. I hope everyone's on 5.3 right now. I know that there are still some projects left on 5.2 and, God forbid, earlier versions, but 5.3 has namespaces and closures, and these bring PHP up to a language that can do all sorts of interesting things and cool things that it could not do before. 5.4 kept up the pace and introduced some more syntactic sugar, like the new shortened array syntax. It also introduced traits, which if you haven't used traits are really cool functionality. I've seen a lot of, as I've been programming, I've been seeing more and more use cases for traits, whereas previously I kind of heard about them and was like, I don't know about traits. I don't really know where I'd use them. But traits have come in handy when I've got classes that aren't really related. There should be no parent-child relationship, but they're duplicating code because they're doing some same things. So traits come in very handy there. The other big thing is the built-in web server in CLI mode. How many have used the built-in web server for projects? The built-in web server comes in really handy for development. I encourage you to use it for development. Don't run a production web server with the built-in web server. Register globals were removed, and so were magic quotes in safe mode. Still going with 5.5, which has just come out, I don't know exactly the date, but it's still pretty recent. Generators and coroutines, which I'm still trying to wrap my head around, but I've seen some pretty awesome things done with them. Simplified password hashing API, list constructs and for each statements, which is really cool. The Zend-op cache extension is now in there by default. In fact, I think it kind of takes over where APC was. Oh, the one last slide that I added, 5.6 is now out in alpha version, which adds some interesting things like variadic functions, which previously, if you wanted a method to, if you wanted to pass in, here, let me try to explain this without a slide to explain it. With a variadic function, you can have named 2 arguments, and then every argument after that, you can have it packed into an array. So you don't have to call func getargs, right? So there's a way to specify that. And then some improvements on SSL and a new CLI debugger, which is pretty cool. So I go through all of that without going into a lot of depth on it, just to kind of get the highlights of where the language has come and how it's improved over the past 10 years, really. But modern PHP development isn't as much about the language and changes in the language as it is in changes in how we build applications. The changes in the language, though, support the ability to build software in new ways with new tools. The rest of the talk is to talk all about how we now build applications. So while PHP 4 had support for simple object inheritance and other object-oriented principles, PHP 5 came out and introduced this whole new object model. And it was during this time, about 10 years ago, that we saw lots of talks on OOP principles. We saw the publication of books and articles and lots of blog posts written about how to write proper object-oriented PHP. The benefits of OOP, such as abstraction, encapsulation, and inheritance, laid the foundation for what would come next in PHP. By no means did PHP invent these things. Other languages already had them. But PHP borrowed things. PHP does that really well. And so we borrowed the things and even made them better in many cases. So what are some features of OOP that we could now do in PHP? I'm not going to go into all of these, but if you're unfamiliar with these terms, I would encourage you to check out my slides later and go look these up. But these are things that are really important in object-oriented principles. And now that we could do them in PHP, we started talking about things like design patterns. And so there were books and articles and blog posts and conference talks all about design patterns during this time. And this is just a handful of some of the more popular design patterns that we talk about. But the one that I think was very important in our kind of community conversation starting around 10 years ago was the model view controller design pattern. This is a standard model view controller diagram coming out of the Gang of Four, well, actually not Gang of Four, I'm sorry, Martin Fowler's, I always get the title wrong, but I have it in my slide notes later, Engineering Patterns of Software Architecture. I'll tell you the title later, but it came out of Martin Fowler's book. To look up more information on object-oriented principles and practices, I would encourage you to check out Brandon Savage's book, Mastering Object-Oriented PHP. Jason Sweat wrote a book around 10 years ago called PHP Architect's Guide to PHP Design Patterns. Still very applicable today, though. And then William Sanders has Learning PHP Design Patterns. It was also around the same time, around 10 years ago, that people started talking more and more about security principles. Prior to this time, people didn't really focus on web application security. And then we had a series of kind of interesting attacks happen. Things happened on Amazon.com, and other things happened on just regular people's forums. But the fact that they would occur on large sites like Amazon brought them to the forefront, and we started talking about them in our community. Most notably, Chris Shiflett launched the PHP Security Consortium and then later published Essential PHP Security, while Stefan Esser pushed for greater visibility and focus on fixing security issues deep within the PHP core. He contributed the Suicide extension, which some of you may be familiar with, which was part of the Hardened PHP project. And most recently, though, this is not, I think that there were several years where we didn't talk about security as much, but now it's starting to pick up again. There's been more focus on security in recent years because the attacks haven't gone away, and people still don't know how to mitigate these attacks. So what were some things that were introduced to our community conversation, our lexicon? These were things such as cross-site scripting, SQL injection, cross-site request forgery, session hijacking, and session fixation. Now, these by no means are all of the attacks. I would encourage you to go check out OWASP Top 10 to find out how to mitigate these attacks, but OWASP also lists a whole bunch of other kinds of attacks that I'm not listing here. But the point is that we started talking about them and focusing on them as a community, which made us write our applications a little differently. The two biggest concepts that came into being were filter input, and here's an example of filtering input. We have, and I'm using the filter extension here because I think the filter extension just really did not get looked at a whole lot. I did not see a lot of people talking about it or even using it. Who uses the filter extension? All right, there's just a few of us. So I would actually be willing to bet that a lot of you use it, but I'll explain why that is in a minute. But you just might not know it. But the filter extension just gives us a handful of functions that were very simple to use. And in the top one here, we're getting an ID, and we're going to use filter input. We're specifying that we get it from a query string parameter, input get. And the query string parameter is widget ID. And then we tell it how we want to filter it. It must validate as an integer. And then I've put it into this clean array as a best practice so that I'm not actually trying to get it directly from the input, the get array. And then if it's clean, I'm going to use a prepared statement now to bind it to this widget ID parameter in my prepared statement and to fetch it from the database. The second thing that we learned was that we should escape our output. These two things will mitigate most attacks. Not all, but most. And that's super simple. Use something like HTML entities, and you give it whatever data that you want to escape. And so the rule of thumb is that any data that the user gave you that you're now going to output, you should always escape that. Any data that comes from an external source, you should always escape. Now, in this one, you might have seen examples that have a second and third parameter passed into them. The second parameter tells kind of a rule of thumb on how to do it. Usually you pass a constant compat quote or compat, something like that. And the third one is you tell what is the encoding to use, which I usually pass UTF-8. In PHP 5.4, I believe it is, now those last two parameters are by default what everyone in the community was saying to pass into them. So you can just call HTML entities. So these are the data filter extension provides these four functions. Please go read up on it. If you're not familiar with it, please start using it in your applications. Now, the reason why we don't use them so much is because frameworks do a lot of this for us already, right? But we need to be diligent and understand what these attacks are and understand how to mitigate them, because if we expect the framework to do it all for us, then we're putting too much trust in that and we might get bit. So we need to make sure that we know exactly what's going on with our data that we're receiving and what's going on with data we're sending back to the client. So essential reading for this, Essential PHP Security. That book is now about 10 years old as well, but it's still very relevant and still very helpful. And then Chris Cornut, whom some of you may know, also runs phpdeveloper.org, now runs webset.io. And then Anthony Ferreira also writes a lot about security and PHP on his blog. The next thing that I want to talk about isn't so much a change that happened in the PHP community, because changes weren't happening in just the PHP community. Changes were happening in other communities as well. One of those is the version control. Well, all the other programming language communities and version control systems started making advancements and leaps and bounds, and making them more robust, more mature. And we started growing up as a community. We started using better practices. Remember earlier I said I used FTP? Well, I learned, and I'll walk you through that in a minute. And so part of this whole growing up as a community and building better applications involves version control. As I said earlier, I had started using FTP. That's not version control, so I'm not putting it here to say that it's version control, but that's how I got started. Who in here else kind of got started with just FTPing files? Just about all of us. The next thing I learned was Dreamweaver MX. Again, not version control, but there's an interesting story here in that Dreamweaver MX allowed you to lock files on a remote server so that while you're editing them, other people could not also open them and edit them. Well, the funny thing about this is that I had a developer that I worked with who used to lock files, work on them, and then go home in the afternoon, leave them locked, and then I would have to try to work on them, but I couldn't. So I'd just go directly onto the server and remove the lock files, and then I could go open them. CVS came along. I started using CVS. It was concurrent versioning systems, and it was really the de facto standard at the time. But then we started seeing that Subversion was coming along as a really good project and made it much more simple to use than CVS. And then finally, as we have grown as developers and grown as developer communities, we have learned that distributed version control is even better. And so now we've got these three big ones on the scene, the biggest of which I think is Git, but Mercurial and Bazaar are also very big in their respective communities. And in fact, I believe Facebook is switching to Mercurial, but they have their reasons behind that. The whole point, though, is you have no excuse. Just go use GitHub or Bitbucket. You can get set up right now learning how to use Git by going to this URL, try.github.io. And it's not about pimping or promoting Git, even though they are a sponsor, right? They sponsored the coupon code. All right. Okay, conference sponsor. But the whole point here is that it's easy to get started with. So go learn it and start using it in your projects. Even if you're the only developer on a project, it is really important to use version control, because then you can always get the history of a file. And you can use GitHub for free or pay $7 a month for like 5 private repos. Bitbucket is free for private repos as well. Free for private, but then you start paying to add team members. Over 5 team members, I think. The next thing that I want to talk about, this is what I think is super important to where we are today in PHP, and that's the auto-loading practices. Before PHP 5, we didn't have it. Before PHP 5, we didn't really have any way to auto-load classes. We had to use include, require, include once, or require once to load class files. And we did this in various ways. We would have like a script that we might require at the top of all of our files, and that one might load all of our class files, and that was fine. But we didn't have an autoloader. And the autoloader sees a class that you're trying to use, and if it's not in scope right now, it goes and tries to find it according to the rules of the autoloader. So PHP 5 introduced this, and this has significantly changed the way we build applications. It's done something else for us than just helping us load files. It has paved the way for common conventions in naming files and in structuring our applications. And then later, in structuring files by namespaces. While different projects may have different naming schemes, almost all of them, though, have adopted conventions because of autoloading principles. This leads me to the next thing that I call the death of a page controller. So what is a page controller? This isn't really something that PHP did on its own, but just a result of several things like security principles, object-oriented programming principles, and the autoloader. We started designing our applications differently. So Martin Fowler's, this is the name of the book, Patterns of Enterprise Application Architecture. This is the standard diagram for a page controller coming out of that book. It looks an awful lot like Model View Controller, but there is a distinct difference, and that is that each individual page is a controller. This is what it kind of ends up looking like. You've got a whole bunch of PHP pages. Every one of them is directly accessible through a URI in a web browser, and in your web server. And your web server acts as the dispatcher. So it receives that URI and says, all right, I'm going to serve up this page, and that page has the code on it that needs to control the actions of the page and to render the page. These pages might include other files and other scripts, like we used to have like a standard convention of like a single include file that might have all of our configuration or things in it. But for the most part, every page controls its own actions. It led to designs that looked a lot like this. So we had our web root, and everything went into the web root. So we'd have our index, our page1.php, we'd also have our CSS and our JavaScript. We'd have an include file here, maybe a config file. All of our PHP classes are in this classes directory because we're still doing object-oriented programming, right? But they're all in that classes directory. And then our config here might have database credentials. Where this gets really bad is what happens when your web server decides not to parse the PHP and instead just send them as plain text. Well, this happened one day on Facebook.com, I don't know how many years ago, 5 years ago now, where it just served the PHP as text. And so now you could see all their code. And it was maybe only a 5 to 15-minute fluke, but it kind of uncovered all of their secrets, right? Well, you don't want your passwords getting out in the open, so you don't want anything that has sensitive information in a place where it could possibly be reached. So we started designing our applications a little differently. We said, all right, we're going to not put everything into the web root. And we started teaching people this as well. And so this led to a design that looked a little bit like this, where we might have all our PHP scripts all in the web root, but our library that they include and our configuration is all outside the web root. And this also kind of led to less of the page controller and more of a front controller, which I'll get to in just a minute. So autoloading and design patterns paved the way to better code structure, which I think paved the way to the burgeoning and bursting on the scene of all the PHP frameworks we have. Earlier I mentioned that the focus on MVC became very great. People were talking about MVC everywhere. Previously in the PHP community, MVC was kind of a taboo thing to talk about. In fact, it was really strange, but design patterns in general were just kind of looked down upon. I'm not sure what it was, but we didn't really like to talk about them. Other communities like to talk about them, and we said that's fine for them. We hate Ruby, so we won't talk about them. But Ruby on Rails happened, right? In around 2004, 2005, and that was a big deal. You could build a blog in 5 minutes just by going through that, so through their tutorial. So PHP decided to start exploring this, and umpteen million, billion, trillion different frameworks happened. All of them using some variation of model view controller or some variation of not model view controller because they were too hip to use MVC. Many frameworks followed this pattern or variations on it. Early frameworks such as Prado and Cake PHP. Who remembers Prado? All right, so a few of us. Cake PHP is still around, but these preceded things like Symfony and Zen framework, and they came out around this time as well. There's too many to name. In fact, I think the Wikipedia page for PHP framework comparison right now has about 80 listed there. But frameworks have ushered in a new era of software constructing. And here are just a few of them so that I can offend everyone who says, you forgot to put my framework on the list. Not only have they made building software easier and faster, but they've created, this is what I think is really important about them, right? They've created new communities, new workflows, and new tool sets. And not only that, they have allowed us to explore, because we had so many of them, we could explore what works and what doesn't work. And what we found is that interoperability is really a good thing. And so we've created the Framework Interoperability Group, otherwise known as PHP Fig. The proliferation of frameworks brought us to where we are today with the PHP Framework Interoperability Group. And this group has released several standards. I'll talk a little bit about the standards in a minute. But the frameworks are all working together now. So this group has just about every major PHP framework is a member of this group, and people who have developed large PHP libraries, such as Doctrine and other libraries, are members of this group as well. They're working together for kind of the first time in the history of the world. Programming language framework communities are working together and making decisions to allow us, the end users, to have a better choice in what we use. I can use libraries from Symfony, or components from Symfony, and I can use components from Zen Framework. I can use components from Aura. I can use components from, Laravel. All these other things, I can work together and build the application I want to build using the tools that make it easy for me to build it. And I'm not locked into one big full stack way of doing things. So here are the PSRs that have been accepted to date, I believe. But there are a few that are currently in draft and discussion form. But we have two autoloading standards, which are a little confusing, but PSR 0 was written to support to be backwards compatible with the old way of doing namespacing, which was the underscore way, right? If we had underscores, that usually denoted a directory, and that was how we namespace things with these huge long class names. So PSR 0 supported both PHP 5.3 namespaces and the old style namespaces. PSR 4 really only supports the new 5.3 and up namespaces, and it also allows you to, yes? PHP Standards Recommendation, I think. There's a weird history to this group, which I won't really go into, but they had to name themselves the Framework Interoperability Group because they used to be called the PHP Standards Group or something, and that didn't fly too well. But PSR 4 is improved autoloading, but that basically means that they're not supporting, this does not support the old style way of namespacing a class, but it also allows you to do shallower directory structures. So you don't have to have the vendor and package in your directory structure. Those can be pulled out, and so you don't have to go too deep into your directory anymore. But we also have a basic coding standard and a coding style guide. PSR 3 is important because it introduces, for the first time, a logger interface, an interface that frameworks are going to standardize on. And there are other interfaces that have been proposed, and such as I think an HTTP client interface, for example, and the maintainers of Guzzle are working on that to help introduce that so that all the frameworks and libraries who adopt this, who adopt all the PSRs, will have a similar or exactly the same HTTP client interface. Actually, I was trying to explain them. I have slides for them. So PSR 0 allows you to do like a directory structure like this. So I've got a namespace class, Ramsey, UUID, and then my tester in this structure. PSR 4, so we'd write it like this. And then PSR 4 kind of lets us have a shallower directory structure. Or we can maintain the same one. It doesn't matter. But you write it the same way. Ramsey, by the way, is a Manx word from the Isle of Man. It comes from the Old Norse word for wild garlic. It also is, in modern day, the name Ramsey. And this is Paul Reinheimer doing what he called quad core, which involved, I think, 4 vodka drinks and 4 straws. This was actually taken down at the Sheraton Gateway by the airport. So coding standards. I wanted to, I think it's worth noting that in the past, a lot of projects that I would look through online, like I would go looking for a PHP library that would do something. And I'd look at the code and it didn't look a thing like code I would write. And so naturally it was ugly. And I didn't see tests. And I didn't see anything that gave me any sense of the quality of the code I was looking at. And there were lots of places you could find libraries, but we just couldn't be certain of the quality. I think we did have things like the pair coding standard, which I had adopted in projects that I did, but not everyone adopted that coding standard. They weren't widely agreed upon within the framework community, though, so different frameworks had their own different coding standards. I think that Symfony originally, their coding standard was for 2 spaces for indentation instead of 4. And some people wanted to use tabs and spaces. Well, the FIG changed this by introducing basic standards and a basic style guide. And by having these, it doesn't mean that you have to adopt them. They're not requirements. But now there are so many libraries out there who have decided to adopt these standards that you can go from one library to the next. And if you've adopted the standards yourself, all the code looks pretty similar. And so it doesn't look ugly by default, right? And consequently, many development shops have adopted these, and such as the one I work for. I would just say kind of like the difference is, and when you go look through PHP code on GitHub, and I think, by the way, GitHub has drastically changed the way we build things too. because we did not previously have a way to just put up your open source libraries in a central place like GitHub. And I think back and we did have things that did this for us, like SourceForge and Google Code, but GitHub has just done something different. It has just changed the way we got excited about it, I think. It's so easy. So, but when I look through PHP projects on GitHub, I am amazed at the quality that I see. And it's not because anyone is enforcing this quality. I think that it is because the community has been encouraging it. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But coding standards have come a long way. People are adopting them and using them. And the tabs versus space war is over, and spaces have won, thank God. But consistency is key. So it really doesn't matter what you use in a coding standard, as long as you adopt something and keep going with it, and you don't change from one line of code to the next. Has he spoken to you? Yeah, okay. This is Chris Hartjes, otherwise known as Grumpy Programmer on Twitter. A good friend of mine. I did work for him. I worked with him for a little while as well. But we have been talking about tests for a while. Sebastian Bergman has been talking about tests for years. He's the creator of the PHP unit library, and that's become the de facto standard in the community. But additionally, as the PHP community has matured and grown up, more and more people are talking about writing tests. And Chris Hartjes is kind of carrying this banner now with just like pounding people on Twitter with his grumpy persona to talk about how we should be testing. I think that a lot of us, as I was getting at with the whole, the code we see on GitHub these days, I think a lot of us take more care of our code these days. And I don't know exactly what's changed that, but it's just, it's evident from the code I look at. And in addition to writing better quality code, I see a lot of libraries out there now that have tests, whereas previously I didn't see that. And so now we're looking at libraries that have tests, and people are focusing on code coverage. And code coverage can be a false sense of security, because it doesn't prove that you've tested every scenario. But having code coverage definitely shows that that you have taken care of your project and that you've covered a lot of the scenarios, or most of them. So a lot of the new terms that have been introduced to our community's lexicon through this focus on testing. Unit tests, functional tests. I bet 10 years ago, if you had asked me on that tram with the smirk on my face what a unit test is, I would have lied my way through it, and it might have sounded like it could have been right, but it probably wouldn't have been right. Test-driven development, behavior-driven development, continuous integration. These are, and code coverage, these are now things we talk about as a community. We consider them when building our projects, whether we need this, whether we don't need it. And if you need to consider whether you don't need it, then you need it. So these are the new terms that have come up in our community. Testing frameworks, I mentioned PHP unit. There are several others though. If you're really going for something simpler, there's Simple Test. Another one that I don't have on the slide though, Ed Finkler has a really simple testing library called FU Test. The letters FU Test. And then BHAT, which is a behavior testing framework, and then Codeception, which I'm not too familiar with, but it looks like an interesting library that has a lot of hooks into frameworks. So now we're looking at projects that look a little more like this. So I showed something similar to this earlier, but now we've got a test directory, and our source code's all in this one spot, all of our web projects in this other spot, all of our configuration is kind of compartmentalized there. So our project's now coming together a little more, getting more mature. And I was mentioning code coverage earlier. I was about to jump ahead of myself. We're starting to see this. And when you start doing code coverage reports, and seeing everything green, it starts eating at you when things are not green. And when you see any yellow or red in there, you're like, I gotta stay up, gotta get the test done, gotta get it all green. So it's like when the light is green, the trap is clean. So seriously, I'm a little bit OCD about making this thing all green. So I sometimes don't even look at the code coverage report, otherwise it will bother me if I know it's not gonna be all green. We have these continuous integration tools. Jenkins is the one that has become kind of the standard in open source continuous integration. There are many others out there. An older one, I believe, is called, Jenkins used to be called Hudson, thank you. So if you were familiar with Hudson, that's now Jenkins. I think Hudson's still around though. I think they just forked. But then there's also cruise control. And so there's there's PHP cruise control, but I'm not quite sure the state of that project anymore. I looked at it and it looked like there had been no changes in like 8 months or so. But here's my recommended reading. Both of them are for Chris Hartjess's books. Chris, I'm still waiting on the previous invoices I sent you. All right, another thing though, as we've talked about testing and our community has grown up around testing and we've made it more of a focus of our applications and our projects, another term that has become really big that I felt was important to mention is dependency injection. So you've probably seen blog posts about this, there have been whole talks at conferences about dependency injection that take up a whole hour. And maybe there have been 3-hour tutorials on dependency injection. It's a really important concept. The main reason it's important is because as we talked about testing, we needed to refactor our code or write new code that can be tested. So it is possible to write a whole project without tests and then to go back and try to write tests for it, and it's really difficult to write tests for because you haven't structured your code in a way that lends itself well to testing. So there's kind of an art around that, like to write code that is testable. So dependency injection is a big term that has come up that not only does it help us write more testable code, it just helps us keep track of where our dependencies are, because here I'll show you an example. In this class, this is a just really contrived example. This is a widget, and we can get a widget by ID, right? We pass an ID into it. So a dependency we have here is $ID. That's our only dependency. But inside the method, when you look inside it, we have $DB equals new database. All right, so we have a dependency on a database, but we're instantiating that from inside the method. What happens when I have to go test this? Well, what happens is that in my unit test, if I'm trying to test this unit of code, and I pass an ID into get by ID, and it calls new database, well, whatever the database class is going to expect some kind of parameters existing. Probably, actually, in this case, we're not passing anything into database, so its constructor probably expects some kind of global config to exist somewhere. So we have to provide that global config to our test, and then that global config, because this database class can't be replaced with another class for testing, it probably wants to talk to a real database. So we probably have to mock up our database. Well, we don't really want to test that this really we don't necessarily want to test that this talks to the database and pulls data out of the database. We'll test the database class independently to test that. What we really want to do is test that this just gives us the result. It gives us whatever it is that it's supposed to give us. As I said, this is very contrived because it's super simple, but I hope the concept, you can see that the concept is when we're testing a unit, we're testing what it's doing, not what all this other stuff is doing around it. So we want to replace the database class when we test it. We want to give it a mock object. We can do that really simple. Here's dependency injection. The second property is the database class. We pass it in. We're not doing anything special on it, so we can mock it. We can create a stubbed out class that's just a dummy class that fits the same interface, or at least just has a query method, and that query method may or may not return anything. In fact, it might just return dummy data, and then we can test that this runs and the test pass. That's dependency injection in a nutshell. So there have been whole talks on that. Now there's a whole bunch of other concepts around it, and there could be much more code to see about it, but that's it. Don't let it be something mystical. Within our community, componentization has taken hold. As I mentioned earlier, frameworks are now componentized. I can use individual components of a framework if I want. There's been a whole ecosystem that's grown up around this. Ed Finkler, if you're familiar with him, he's Funkatron on Twitter. A few years ago, he wrote this micro PHP manifesto. This was a rally cry for the use of smaller libraries, for the creation of smaller libraries, and focus on libraries that do one thing and do it well. And I think a lot of people have really bought into that and are building just tiny little libraries and collections of libraries that you can pick and choose what you want from them. And the frameworks are doing the same thing. PHP code is looking a lot better, as I've said earlier. Another thing that we have is that with integration and coupling is that we're no longer just like writing our own code a lot of times. The PHP community is one of the few communities, I won't say few anymore, but I've never seen the not invented here mentality in this community. The whole idea that if we didn't invent it, we have to go write it ourselves. We have to write our own code, everything. Well, I don't see a lot of PHP developers do that, because we go and look for libraries, and we find the libraries that will solve the need that we have, and we pull it down and integrate it within our application. So there's a lot more of that, even more so than there used to be going on these days. And we don't just deal with local data sources anymore. We talk to APIs all over the place. Every project I work on nowadays talks to at least 2 or 3 external APIs for something, or more. It just depends on what we need. The single biggest contributor to this ecosystem I keep talking about of components, I believe, is Composer. If you're not familiar with Composer, I would encourage you to get familiar with Composer and make it part of your daily, or not daily, but make it part of your project, every project you write. Composer is a dependency management tool for PHP packages. It uses a website called packagist.org, or you can roll your own packages website, or use anyone else's. It doesn't lock you into that. But this is where everyone is distributing their open source libraries, their components. Zend framework components are here. Symfony 2 components are here. Laravel's code is here. Aura's components are here. Every other framework person who's going to get mad at me for not mentioning their frameworks components are here. All sorts of other libraries are available here. Not just frameworks, but just any library that someone creates and wants to distribute. They've been putting them into Composer or into Packagist and distributing them through Composer. Now, the thing that I was saying earlier about code quality and tests is that when I look at any Composer library, any library that's intended for distribution through Composer, I'm seeing this trend of good quality code, people who follow standards, people who write tests, or packages who have tests. And I think it's not, I know it's not because Composer enforces this, but this community that's building up around these distributable components is encouraging these practices. And I think this is a really great thing for our community. And that's why I'm talking about it here. Because if you're not familiar or aware of these things going on, please take a look at them, because you'll become a better programmer for doing so. You'll be encouraged to write cleaner code. You'll be encouraged to write a library and put it out there for the rest of the world to use. So if you're not familiar with Composer, it's sort of like Node Package Manager in the sense that you've got a file called composer.json that sits in your project root, and you put your requirements in it. There's a whole bunch of other stuff you can put in there too, but this is a super simple example where it's just requiring my library, and if I run composer install from within this directory, it pulls it down and puts it into a vendor directory. Very useful. So where does that leave Pear? Someone said boo? That's harsh. I came up with Pear. I don't know if I don't know how many people in here used Pear, but it was the standard of PHP libraries. It had the ultimate goal that a central governing body, who actually was elected every year or every couple of years, and I can't remember, but they were an elected body, and they would manage Pear, and they would also approve new packages and would ensure that packages that were there didn't grow stagnant but would have maintainers. So if one maintainer went away, they'd make sure that that package would have someone who could watch after it. It was a noble goal, and I think it was a really good goal. But over time, we saw Pear stagnate, and which was really unfortunate. There were a lot of good people in that community. It was a really good idea. I think Composer now is taking that place, though. And there are things around Composer that are kind of taking the place of the aggregation of packages, of the, what's the word I'm looking for? It's curation of packages. So there's a group right now that calls themselves the PHP League, or the League of Extraordinary Packages, or something like that. And they are taking packages, or anyone is actually able to contribute to them, and to take a package that you have that you want to put into the League of Packages, and they are maintaining them. You would become the maintainer as long as you follow their rules. So your package has to have tests, it has to have certain code coverage percentage, it has to follow certain coding standards, but they're kind of taking that place. And there's others around too. There's people in the Composer community who have been talking about some kind of body that would certify packages, or that would curate packages, the best of the packages. But normally what I like to do is I go into Packagist, and I'm looking for like a particular topic, and I'll look for the one that's been downloaded the most. And so it's sort of self-selecting. It sort of bubbles up the packages that are the most popular to the top. Those aren't always the best packages, but if it's got a lot of downloads, I can be pretty certain that a lot of people have looked at it too and have validated it. Yeah, and I'll go look at the code too. I don't just take that word, the word of 1,000 people have downloaded it. I'll go look at the code and make sure that, just at a glance. I don't have to go through everything line by line, although that's not a bad thing if you're using third-party code. But I will, take a look at the code. Does it follow standards? Take a look at the tests. Can I run the tests? Do I have to jump through a bunch of hoops to run the test, or can I just run them right away? So I'm not really sure what the future of Pear looks like, but I definitely think there's a big future for Composer, and I really think that Composer has single-handedly revitalized and rejuvenated development in the PHP community. PHP is not only PHP. So there's a lot more to modern PHP development than just PHP. We don't just develop only PHP. PHP, it's about all the tools we use around how we develop PHP. And these tools include things like Vagrant and VirtualBox. How many are using Vagrant for development? This is an awesome tool for spinning up virtual machines. Almost every project I start now, I make sure it's got a Vagrant file and some Puppet manifests. But you don't have to use Puppet, you could use Chef, or I think there's a way to use Salt or some other tools. But the thing is, this allows me to have virtual machine that is always the same. no matter where I'm using it. I don't have to do a whole lot of system setup anymore. So these are really good tools for development. The cloud, we develop in the cloud a lot nowadays. And what comes with that are our whole tool sets around how we develop in the cloud. We develop on platform as a service layers these days, Engine Yard, Pagoda Box, AppFog. I also know that Heroku is working on PHP. So Heroku, if you're familiar with them, they do Python, Ruby, Node, maybe some others. They are working on PHP now. So I hear. We're not just LAMP anymore. Remember the term LAMP? Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP? We work on a variety of different web servers now. Nginx, we might use things like Varnish for proxy caching. We might use a whole bunch of stuff at AWS. Like I personally use CloudFront and S3 and all sorts of other things. It's not just Apache anymore. We have elastic load balancers. We don't just use MySQL anymore. In fact, the company Moontoast is switching over to MongoDB. But there's other databases out there that people are using. We use queuing systems nowadays, like Gearman and RabbitMQ. And lastly, PHP is still very much a web development language. It's entrenched in the web. It's grown up with the web. So the JavaScript and HTML5 communities and ecosystems are very much a part of PHP is very much a part of them. Not a whole lot has changed with the way that PHP works with these, but JavaScript's importance has greatly increased in the last 5 years. It's had its own renaissance and rejuvenation. It's become kind of a norm of programming. So, so changes to the language and ecosystem have led us to improvements in software design, security practices, software lifecycle with version control, code structure and project layout, code quality, testing and coverage, and dependency management. So what do PHP projects look like these days? Well, here's an example that I took from a project that I have been working on. And this is a lot of my projects kind of start looking like this these days. So I'm going to talk just through this real quick. So that .puppet and the Vagrant file kind of go together. So that helps me create my virtual machine for development. I have a bin in here because I have some like scripts that I put in there that I'll use for development, that I develop and use. Config for configuration, source for all of my PHP libraries. So all of my namespace PHP libraries go in there. Some people call it a library folder. Some people use the word source. It doesn't really matter what you name it. My test directory, if it's a web project, I've got a web folder. That's my public folder. I might call it public. I might call it www. I might call it web like you see here. It doesn't really matter how you name it. A bunch of other tools that I use. I use Bower for pretty much dependency management of JavaScript libraries. So what you see down here, I've got a package.json, which is a node for Node Package Manager, and a bower.json. And that package.json, when I run npm install, pulls down Bower and all of its dependencies, puts it locally, and then I can run a Bower command to get all those commands. I've got a gem file here because I'm using, I think the only thing that I had in this gem file was for apiary, has a gem that you can use to help you build API documentation from Markdown, essentially, PHP unit. So I throw this up here just to kind of give a glimpse of the fact that PHP, like I said, is not just PHP. It's all these different things. We aren't just PHP developers. We have to be full web developers. And this isn't always just web either. So there's a whole lot going on there that is involved in modern PHP development than just the LAMP stack. So where does this leave us with the future of PHP? Where is PHP heading? I didn't even pay attention to the time. Have I run us out of time? Oh, I'm sorry. Well, what about PHP 6? Well, there were a lot of books published because there was a lot of excitement. right? And seriously, the publishers released these covers of books a few years back, and there was a big uproar about the covers having PHP 6 on them, and PHP 6 is one of those things that we just don't talk about anymore. Essentially, Unicode kills languages and babies, or so I stole that quote from Sean Coates. The PHP needs you to help support it, to help make it grow, to make it a better language. You can submit your own RFC to PHP if you have a language idea. As Chris said at the beginning of the talk, I authored the array column function, and that just came from someone else saying, you know what, I really think that PHP should have this functionality, and I said, I think I could actually write that, and then I did, and then it sat there for like 5 years and never did anything, and then finally I decided to submit it after PHP got on GitHub. That was when it made it easy for me to just go do a pull request. I wrote an RFC, I learned the whole process. You can do that too. You don't have to even know C code. You can become a contributor on the mailing lists. You can be a bug tester, or you can work on the QA team. You can submit a language feature and find someone else to help write it for you. So there's a lot you can do. And then where does that leave the future of the PHP community? User groups are starting up like never before. I remember 10 years ago when this group started, there were probably, excuse me, probably a handful in this country that I could name off the top of my head. Now there's like too many to even keep up with, and they're starting up everywhere. Community conferences are starting everywhere. Years ago, we just had maybe 2 or 3 big PHP conferences in the country. Now, as Chris went through the list earlier, they're everywhere. Frameworks are proliferating, as are framework communities and library communities. And lastly, as I said about PHP, the PHP community needs you to help start up user groups, to help with community conferences, to speak at conferences, to write articles, to write blog posts, to keep it going. There's a whole conversation here. And I feel like that I've come from that like old conversation, and now it's time for a new conversation, new ideas, and new thoughts to make our language a better language and to make our community a better community. I think the popularity of PHP is only getting stronger. There was a couple of years ago, there was a keynote at one of the European conferences that talked about like these curve trends. They had graphs that showed popularity of languages, and they predicted that PHP would not die out, but it would wane in popularity in about 5 years, and then after that, just slowly kind of peter off, tail off. But like, I can't see that right now, because as we're seeing this renaissance in the language, especially with things like Composer, making people excited about writing packages and getting them contributed back to the community, it's only growing and getting stronger. So with that, I leave you with a charge to get involved in the PHP community, to write better code, to write cleaner code, write tests in your code, and write open source packages that you can contribute back, or go find a package that you can contribute to. Thank you.
We got a little bit more to do. We've got a handheld mic so you can get picked up by the audio. If anybody got a few things you want to ask Ben?
I will say, because this became confusing at one point, that I did not take the elephant pictures, but they are all Creative Commons licensed pictures, and I have links to all of them at the end. So if you download the slides, you'll have links. All right.
PHP versus Ruby. Go.
I'm not going to...
Quick questions we want.
I don't actually have a strong opinion. I like both languages, but I like PHP because it's what I really kind of got started in with the community, and it's been a good community to me. And so I have worked with Ruby, I've worked with Python. They have good communities too, but the PHP community, I guess, is where my heart is. Any other questions?
Hey, Ben, this is a very good-natured gotcha question. You said that there's no not invented here in PHP. Then why are there 80-plus frameworks? Why are there 80-plus frameworks?
I didn't hear what you said.
The not invented here in PHP?
Oh, that's a good question. That is a really good question. I don't know the answer to that, but you got me. I'm going to have to revise that now. Anything else? All right. Thank you very much.